Patch Island here was surveyed in the 1790s and was proposed to be a fort here to protect Philadelphia and everything up along the Delaware here. After the War of 1812, there was concern to keep those ports open. So it was actually constructed to keep people out, not to keep people in. It was completed around the time of the Civil War. And as the war broke out and the Union had more and more victories, there was an issue of where to keep all the prisoners. Meanwhile, the Confederate Navy was pretty weak, so it was evident that there wouldn't be an attack coming up the river. And the government made the decision that Fort Delaware would be an ideal place as a prisoner of war camp. Being on an island, there's access for boats to bring in prisoners, and also it would be difficult to escape from. Fort Delaware is kind of unique as many other Civil War prisons go because most of them would house one type of prisoner, such as officers. But at Fort Delaware, we had a little bit of everything. There were high-ranking officers, there were regular enlisted men, there were also some federal convicts, ordinary criminals, and then there were political prisoners as well. When President Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus, you could be arrested for just about anything. If you made a comment about the flag, you might end up here. So there are a lot of ordinary citizens here as well, many of them from Delaware. If you were a high-ranking officer, you were treated pretty well. You were kept inside the fort. If you were a lower-ranking enlisted man, you'd be out in the barracks outside of the fort where conditions weren't nearly as nice. If you knew somebody in the north, you could have things mailed to you. A lot of people received packages of, additional food and sundry items and things that they needed. But if you didn't know anybody in the north, then your condition wasn't nearly as good. It was certainly no country club, but as Civil War prisons went, the conditions here were much better than many. Max Neueges was a German-born Jewish soldier who we believe moved to Darlington, South Carolina around late 1850s, and he was a clerk in a shop there. And he enlisted in the Confederate Army, and I think his troop was deployed to Virginia. He was severely injured, went back to Darlington to recover, and then as soon as he got to Gettysburg, deserted after about a day. And he sort of had to survive on his own for a few days and was eventually picked up by a New York militia and brought here to Fort Delaware. And while he was here, he became friends with Lieutenant Wolfe, who was one of the officers in charge here. So we're not really sure of that relationship dynamic, but we do know that it gave him access to a lot of areas that no prisoners would be in. And while he was here, he drew some amazing sketches that have been saved for the historical record, and it just gives us a great account of what some of these interiors looked like, and we've even based some of our restoration in these rooms on his sketches. So it's very important to us from a historical perspective. The Delaware Historical Society has an original Neueges bird's eye view of the entire fort, which is pretty amazing considering he was a Confederate soldier and probably didn't have, well, you wouldn't think he would have access to these places. There's a few sketches of the inside of the officers' quarters, as well as some bird's eye views, and I believe some sketches of the kitchen and some other prisoner areas. Baldwin Coolidge came out here as member of the 6th Massachusetts. He was on the other side of the coin. He was a guard here. And, he was a 19-year-old kid who liked to draw. And so there's a wonderful sketchbook that exists of his at the Delaware Historical Society, and that gives us some interesting pictures we wouldn't normally have. Has probably 15 to 20 sketches of various views of Fort Delaware, including cannons and some soldiers, and as well as officers. One in particular that was striking to me was a guy being hung by the thumbs. And we have read in some of the other historical records that was a punishment actually inflicted more often on a guard that might have deserted or have been remiss in his duty. So that was definitely a punishment that some of the guards would have received. So his sketches are another wonderful record from the other side of the war. And Baldwin Coolidge actually went on to be a very famous photographer up in Boston, which we were interested to find out sometime later. Was famous for his photographs of Boston communities, maritime photos as well. So became a very famous artist in his own right. We don't have a lot of photographs of Fort Delaware of the time, so this is sort of a way in for people to learn about the history of the Civil War in Delaware, which is fascinating on its own. And it gives us two individuals to sort of use as vessels to learn about that life here during the Civil War. History is not really about facts and figures, memorizing names and dates. People want to hear the stories of what happened here, and that's really how you learn about it and understand it better. And so those sketches give you a true picture through somebody else's eyes of what it was like to be here. You know, it's a great place to learn about history. You know, it's the most amazing piece of architecture in Delaware. It really is.